You're listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, brought to you by the Raven Creek Social Club, where we talk about faith and other oddities. For questions, comments, or to be part of the conversation, join us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, where you can find us at Raven Creek SC. Now for your hosts, Emily Dixon and Nathan Underwood.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome back to Faith and Other Oddities, the show where we believe the Bible's a lot more fun when you're not just quoting Paul out of context, right? That's not aimed at anyone. But
I was getting ready to say, that wasn't aimed at anyone, was it?
No, it wasn't. But if it offends you, change your ways. So, we are still going through the book of 1 Samuel, having fun. We just got introduced to Goliath last week, and we're getting ready to jump into the story of David and Goliath. So
yeah, we'll see how far we get.
Yeah.
How many rabbit trails I end up chasing on all of this.
Yeah, so that's chapter 17 for those of you playing at home.
Right. We're going to get ready to go into verses 8 and 9. But just a little recap, we were talking about how David's own personal journey really does reflect the journey of Israel, and it foreshadows Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to keep all those things at play as we're going through the rest of the narrative, because this really is about creating sacred space.
Okay.
And sacred space is a huge deal within the Bible, and it begins as an earthly location with the Garden of Eden.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, we lose that. It's God
Pretty quickly, too.
Right. Maybe in an afternoon, depending on how you read the story. When you listen to some scholars, it's like God made Eve and she gets up and goes to Adam and goes, "Hey, would you like a snack?"
Right.
Like those are her first words to him, is what it sounds like. But then sacred space is begun, the process to begin claiming it again. It was carried through with Abraham. And then, of course, they wind up in Egypt. And then when they return from Egypt, there's the whole conquest of Canaan.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't want to go in because there's giants. And so here we are back with David facing giants, the Rephaim. This time, instead of a nation, we have the one who will be the representation of the entire nation as the king. So now that you've got that to kind of play with as we go through the rest of the story, I think it just continues to get even more interesting. So,
well, how could it not?
It will not disappoint. The whole book doesn't disappoint. So verses 8 and 9, and I'm going to read those. He stood, this is referring to Goliath,
mm-hmm.
and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." So there's like this major theology lesson within this speech. And, why have you drawn up for battle? Who do you think you are?
Mm-hmm.
What right do you have to defy us? Am I not, it's actually, the Hebrew is more specific. Am I not the Philistine?
Okay.
And so am I not superior to you? And this isn't, a baseless boast. I mean, the Philistines were technologically advanced. I mean, we've already got this account of armor,
mm-hmm.
the use of iron. They are on the cutting edge. They conquered other people already to claim Canaan as their primary homeland.
Right.
They're one of the Rephaim. That means they're literally direct descendants of the gods, of the little e Elohim, the
mm-hmm.
godlets.
Yeah, the Watchers.
Yeah, the Watchers. He's, huge. He's a massive guy. He's got that on his side, a reason to brag about who he is. And, he is the Philistine. He's the epitome of what it means to be a Philistine, is basically what he's saying. And in rabbinic tradition, he's actually considered to be the Philistine who killed Hophni and Phinehas when the Ark of the Covenant was captured.
Okay.
Now, is that true? Who knows? Could it be true? Oh, yeah, absolutely. So it's one of those curious tidbits.
Well, and if
Hophni
and Phinehas were carrying the ark, and then he killed the people who were bearing their God, or in their mind,
mm-hmm.
then yeah, that would make sense if he would
Yeah.
Hmm.
It's a fun little exercise, and the rabbis have a lot of fun with Goliath himself. Um, Another little tidbit that I think is interesting, there's a belief that, you know what? I think I go into this later. Let's go into it later.
Okay.
So there's a teaser for you. So anyway, he asks, "Are you not servants of Saul?" Notice he doesn't say, "Are you not servants of Yahweh? Are you not servants of the God of Israel?"
Hmm.
He points directly to Saul, and it's an accurate description of Israel at this time because Saul isn't representing God. And if Saul had been representing God, then we would be able to say, hey, yeah, they are servants of the true God. Instead, they're being held captive by one of their own.
Hmm. Hmm.
And one of their own who's unstable. And, he is the king like other nations. We've already established that in previous episodes. If you want to study that, just start at the beginning of the Saul story. And, Saul is actively taking people for his own purposes.
Hmm.
That's been plainly stated that anytime there was a Gabor Chagil, a mighty man of valor, he brought them into his house and he kept them.
Hmm.
And that's going to continue to be his practice. So now the nations, it is, he is cowering, and the nation of Israel is cowering before Goliath, just like any other nation would. And they're looking at possible enslavement, and Saul's nowhere to be seen. By all standards, he should be the one on the front lines.
Right.
He's the closest thing that Israel has to a giant.
Hmm.
So why isn't he out there? And that's troublesome because as the king, as the defender of the nation, as the resident giant,
Hmm.
he should be the one who's there. And the thing is that the nation really is at the mercy of a madman. And this is a king who requires a boy to keep him in line, to keep
Hmm.
him balanced so he can function. Here's a national leader who can't even do anything without a child at his side. And there's no honor or glory to being the servant of Saul.
Right.
So when you put all of that into play, you realize that Goliath might actually have a clue as to what he's talking about. And that's the thing about evil when it's presented in the Bible. This is not some kind of dumb, stupid entity trying to come against God's people. It's always intelligent. It's always smart.
Hmm.
And Goliath really embodies how smart and how aggressive and how fearless evil is, even in the face of evidence that it has no right to be.
Right.
So, verse 10 and 11, the Philistine said, I defy the ranks of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together. And when Saul and all of Israel had heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid. So, only twice in this entire story is Goliath referred to by name.
Okay.
He is always the Philistine. The rest of the time,
Yeah.
always, because obviously there's two exceptions. And I defy, Bergen says a better translation of that is I heap shame upon the armies of Israel. So it's more of a taunt than what we realize. It really is kind of this degrading language and not just come out and meet me.
Well, yeah. I mean, it would be saying it's shameful. The way you're all hiding away is a shameful act, kind of thing.
Yeah. Now, Zamora actually, he translates it with reproach. I reproach you, which actually falls in the line with what evil does in the Bible and other stories because it's an accuser.
Okay.
And says, hey, here's your problem. This is what's wrong with you. This is who you are. I'm going to define you instead of allowing God to define you. And so that's also in keeping. The fact that I've got two kind of heavyweights weighing in on the same word with a little difference, they're similar.
Sure.
And I don't think there's a major conflict there. And probably if you are a native speaker of Hebrew, it would fall somewhere on a spectrum
Between those.
So the limits of translation, But Goliath, he sees what the problem has been. And the problem is that they have enslaved themselves to this weak king that they demanded.
Right.
And they're weak because they have they've forgotten they belong to God.
Yeah.
They think they belong to Saul. But I love this one line, and the reason why I love it, give me a man.
Okay. Now,
Why?
which word for man are we there?
I didn't even look. I'm bad about that.
No.
Because
Go ahead.
no, I don't even have my phone to go look it up because it would be interesting to know. I'm thinking it's probably going to be ish,
Okay.
but if it was Adamah, that would be even better.
I was thinking a Gibor would be interesting.
Possibly, but we'll go with what I got. We'll have to look that up.
Okay.
But the implication is that there is no man in Israel. They had abandoned the one who had created them in their image, so they are no longer in the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
And also, when Christ arrives, how does he arrive to confront the enemy? He arrives as a man, and he gives the enemy exactly what they ask, what Goliath and even other embodied evil ask for. A man, not a god, because they know they can't take on a god, but they know that they can defeat humanity if humanity is not connected to God, and that's still true today. So
that's verse 8. Was that right?
I believe so.
In ESV it says choose a man, or is it?
Actually, it's verse 10.
Verse 10. Okay.
And so, in the ESV it would be a man.
Yeah, give me a man that we may. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to find it to see if I can.
Bible Hub Interlinear.
Well,
so, but
I'm on my way.
Yeah.
Make sure I got the right verse.
And so that's a really I think it could be interesting to see exactly what they say there. And I hate it when I don't pick up on stuff that you do. But anyway,
sorry.
But the charges Goliath is bringing, they're very accurate, and that's the thing with a good enemy. They know how to strike at your weak points, and it's interesting that he calls for a man knowing that he's a Rephaim. He knows that the scales are tipped in his balance. So even though he's putting on this big display, it's
Ish.
It is Ish. Okay, so he knows that he can overcome a man. He knows he can't overcome God. And then all this talk about servants. Now, the ESV translates it servants. Another possible translation is slaves. But now you've got that connection right back to Egypt. And we know that the Philistines within the book of Samuel, they're always going to represent the Egyptians. And we do know that the Philistines, they love enslavement. This is always what they're after. We have that with Samson in the temple of Dagon.
Mm-hmm.
We have that with Abraham, with Abimelech. We have it with Isaac, with Abimelech, who we often forget was the king of the Philistines. And so, what did the Philistines do? Every time you go to the Philistines, the king takes your wife. I mean, this is what happens all the time. And then the Philistines equaling the Egyptians in this scenario in Samuel, with Samuel equaling Moses, we see once again that the object of the enemy, and I think this is really significant, the object of the enemy is not to kill if he can enslave. The enemy will enslave always if that's a choice. If there's an option to enslave God's people, that's going to be the first thing they do. And we see that that's true today. How many people do we know who are enslaved to drugs, enslaved to whatever habit or mindset or anything that has taken away life and degrades them as a human being?
Mm-hmm.
It's still very much a part of our world. And when we forget that all of these problems have a spiritual component, then we don't have the right weapons with which to fight our wars.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and that's not to discount, like we were talking about last week. It's not to discount the psychological and actual, physical things and whatnot. That's to be used in conjunction,
right?
So.
Yeah, and that's the thing. We've got to balance it out. Those tensioners that we're always talking about, and the you've got to have that tension. But when you look at this speech of Goliath, and then you look at Jesus and who he was, we have a man.
Mm-hmm.
Who overcomes evil, frees us from the powers of sin and evil, so we're not enslaved to it anymore. And he reveals the inability of humanity to face this supernatural enemy on their own.
Right.
So I love that, because we act like, oh, well, if you're just brave enough to walk onto the battlefield, you're going to be fine. That's the modern day version of the David. You just have to step out there and, be who you are, use your skills. And David's story is not about that. It was never about just who David was. It's about who David is when he's working with God in God's purposes and plans. And we can't overlook that because this is a supernatural enemy. And Goliath isn't just some guy, like I said last week, with a pituitary problem. He really is the result of a spiritual union with humanity. And that's really where ugly things happen, when the wrong kind of spirituality connects with humanity. And we still give birth to ugly things in our lives when that occurs. Maybe not Nephilim, but
sure,
the principle's still there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So, okay, got to chase a major rabbit trail on this one, so hang on.
Okay, go for it.
We're on verse 12. Now David was the one of the Ephrathite, I love that word, of Bethlehem in Judah, named Jesse, who had 8 sons. In the days of Saul, the man was already old and advanced in years. Okay, so this is a weird verse. Why do we need to know that Jesse's old? That was the first thing I thought of when I read it.
Is this a callback to Abraham?
Close. You're in the right book. So
yeah, but a lot happened in that book.
Right. There's what, 49 chapters. So anyway, why do we need to know Jesse's old? Okay, so number one, it could possibly be so we understand he's not on the battlefield because he's too old. He's no longer obligated to take part in military action.
Gotcha.
So reasonable, for that to read that way. But Rabbi David Silva, I've referenced him before, and he proposes a second reason. And he's with Drisha, and Drisha has a lot of their lectures online. If you don't speak or read Hebrew, they might be a little difficult because they do a lot of things in Hebrew. But there's enough English in there. I think most people can follow it. But he says that we need to know that David is the son of Jesse's old age. And he sees this as a link back to Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother.
Okay, yeah.
So I'm going to give you the summary of what he presented, and because this was just so good. So Benjamin, he's the youngest of Jacob's son. He was born immediately after God promises Jacob that he will be the father of kings and who will possess the land promised to Abraham. That's in Genesis 39. So the seeming implication, because God says you will give birth to kings, is that the son who's born next will be the king, not that the sons he had prior to this will be the king. That's kind of a lot of the ways that when we look at biblical prophecy, how it works. And then the writer of the writer of Samuel seems to even strengthen this connection. Not only do we have Jesse's old age, we have Ephrathite from Bethlehem. Well, Genesis 35:19. So died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath. That is Bethlehem. And so we know that Benjamin in the story becomes the stand-in for Joseph.
Okay.
So, by the way, that verse was talking of Rachel. That's Benjamin's mother. She died immediately on birth. Remember, that connects back to when the Ark of the Covenant was taken. The news arrived to town, and one of Eli's son's wives was giving birth, and that story connected directly back to Rachel.
Gotcha.
And so we've still got this tie going back to the Benjamin story. And Benjamin's the stand-in for Joseph, because when Joseph is gone, then Jacob relies on Benjamin. He doesn't want to let Benjamin go. He's scared to let the brothers take him to Egypt. And he sees this as a foreshadowing of how David is going to be the replacement for Saul. Saul fails, and he sends himself into exile. It wasn't that Saul was sent into exile by his brothers, but Saul did it to himself.
Okay.
And in doing that, he threatens to send all of Israel into exile with him. It's just like all of Israel winds up following Joseph to Egypt.
Gotcha. Okay.
So another interesting link is this theme of replacement is picked up in Esther.
Okay.
Because if you read in Esther, let me find the verse, 119, it says, and let her royal position be given to one who is better than she. Well, we know that Saul's throne is going to be given to a neighbor who is better than him. That's the words that Samuel spoke to him in 1 Samuel 15:28. And so this is all keeping within the framework. And by the way, Esther was of the Benjamin tribe. It's all keeping with the framework set up within Genesis. So we have this connection, and it's a reminder that even though David is out of the tribe of Judah, he has ties with that tradition of Benjamin. And with that promise that God had given to Jacob, that Jacob would have sons who were kings. Now it winds up being Judah.
Okay.
But at the same time, Benjamin, the promise right before Benjamin's birth is not forgotten. It's actually fulfilled, but it's fulfilled in a way that Jacob could not have foreseen.
Sure.
And well, he kind of foresees it a little bit. We see it in the blessing he gives to the sons, but there's also a debate on how much of that was Judah was actually going to be king and how much of it is Benjamin was still going to retain a royal line.
Right.
So, and the whole book of Samuel is about this replacement idea, because we even open with Samuel replacing Eli, and it's where the flaws of the mentor pave the way for the protege.
Mm-hmm.
And so, of course, we see this theme continued in the New Testament because Jesus becomes the second Adam.
Right.
So this idea of being replaced and having someone step up to do the job that you were unwilling to do becomes very integral within the book of Samuel itself. So, yeah, it's
a lot of that. That's a lot of layers.
I think this is the point in the Bible, right here with Samuel, that we really do start to see how the layers are stacked on top of each other.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And you don't see it in Genesis because you haven't built enough. And you don't see it in the New Testament because most people don't teach the Old Testament. So,
Right.
So when you're here, you can kind of look both ways. And it's kind of that pinnacle that allows you to see in all directions.
Sure.
So moving on in verse 13 and 15, this is the encounter with Jesse's sons. His three oldest sons are on the front lines. We have the names Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, and they followed Saul. So that they are people who support Saul. And that's an interesting note because they know their brother's the next king.
Yeah.
You would think that they would have got, hey, it's our brother. He's the next king. Let's go oust Saul. Let's get David in place, and then our family's just going to prosper.
Well, I think that just kind of speaks to kind of their faithfulness to what's going on, as to not just decide for their own selfish gain to overturn the system.
Yeah. Well, there's that. I kind of think it's a combination of, he's our little brother. Yeah, Samuel came along. He did this funky little ritual. Maybe he's right, maybe he's not, but, it's our little brother. Do we really expect him to be the one?
Right.
And then at the same time, there is that element, Saul is God's anointed, so you don't mess with him.
Right.
So the three sons here are probably all that Jesse is required to send into battle of his sons. There'd be an obligation to provide so many men for the wars. He probably didn't have to send the rest of them, or maybe they're the only ones old enough to serve, because you have to be 20 years old in order to serve in the army, according to the book of Numbers.
Okay.
And, we're given this glimpse of the fact that David is Saul's right-hand man in the palace, but he's still the errand boy when he's at home.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's living this really divided life where where does he fit?
Yeah. Well, and because it earlier says he became the armor bearer, but now he's back watching the sheep again.
Mm-hmm.
Where is it? Like, what's the...
Well, and he was probably at this point traveling back and forth between the two places. He would probably go home for a few days, go back to Saul, go back, because Saul had more than one armor bearer.
Well, sure.
And the fact that he hadn't totally been relinquished, and we're actually going to find out in a later verse that he is allowed to go back home because this verse in, I believe it's chapter 18, says that from that day, he was not allowed to go return to his father's house. So
Okay.
there seems to be the implication that before that, yeah, there was a lot of back and forth. And, for a young man like David, walking 10 miles was nothing. He could do that twice a day.
Right.
Not a big deal. So,
Well, when that's the mode of transportation everyone's used to anyway.
oh, yeah, if you're used to it, it isn't a big deal. It's whenever we start sitting at desk too long, like I've been doing.
Riding in cars.
Yeah.
Things like that.
So, and he may have had a donkey to ride. Who knows? All these details that the Bible doesn't give us because they don't think we need them.
Well, yeah.
I mean, obviously we didn't, but inquiry minds. So, but verse 16, we're told that that Goliath stands for 40 days to make his taunt, and he does this every morning and every night. And of course, we're that 40.
Mhm.
We're thinking of Egypt. We're thinking of coming out of there, the wilderness journeys, and that time of testing and trial. We're thinking of Christ, temptation in the wilderness.
Yeah, that's that. I usually think of that or the flood.
Mhm.
Generally.
Exactly, is that confrontational moment with evil,
Mhm.
that sifting out and that sorting through what are you made of is pretty much what 40 represents. So Jesse sends David to the battlefield, with a care package for the troops. And I thought this was really interesting. He sends a gift for the commander. So he sends the brothers parched grain, and he sends the commander 10 different kinds of cheeses, or 10 cheeses. Of the two, one is, nachos that you feed the kids, and one is kind of a gourmet offering to a special guest. And I think we see not only the mechanism for how David gets to the front lines. I mean, he's sent by his father, obviously, but we're seeing a little glimpse of Jesse here.
Mhm.
Because if your boys are on the front line fighting a battle and you give them, a bag of chips or something, and you're sending the good stuff to their commander, what are you doing? I think he's playing politics.
Well, that's not unlikely. The part that I found interesting was where he says, "Oh, where is it? See if your brothers are well and bring some token from them."
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, like, are they sending their wages back? Is that what's going on?
That's
or
one.
Is it just some kind of like, see if they got any cool war spoils or something? Just like what's he doing there?
That's the thing. We really don't know. That's kind of obscure. And I think what we're seeing is the idea that there's some kind of proof of life, which,
Sure.
Whatever that might be, there is no real clear indication from either within the Bible itself or from other cultures what this could be.
Right.
And so, it could be just as simple as just let me know they're still there.
Yeah.
And I need to know that. What that looked like officially, anybody's guess. As a matter of fact, it's so obscure. Most of the things I read were basically, we don't know. I mean, that was,
Well, yeah, fair enough.
Most people didn't even bother to make a guess. But I do think that we are seeing that Jesse is possibly trying to even, butter up their commander for the brothers and saying, hey, my sons maybe don't need to be on the front lines, or make sure they get all their rations for their food, or make sure, I think he is trying to be smart. And when you remember that Jesse is the grandson of Ruth, and think about how she manipulated the whole situation with Boaz to get what she wanted, Jesse comes from a line of schemers.
Sure.
And so the fact that David grew up in a household with a man who says, hey, I know how to grease the wheels. I know how to show, when showing honor is correct and gets things done. It kind of sheds a little bit of light on why David is the way he is.
Okay. I can see that.
So in verses 19 through 24, we have a description of the scene, and this time it's with David in it. And there's a lot of fun little details. He leaves the sheep with the keeper. The writer's very careful to make note of that. He's a good shepherd, even in the middle of this national conflict and crisis. He doesn't lose sight of what his primary duties are. As Jesse commands him, so he's obedient to the father, he goes to the battlefield. So we get to see that he is a son who can be sent into battle, and he will put himself in dangerous situations and in inconvenient situations for the sake of obedience.
Mhm.
So this is a good thing.
One thing I wanted
Okay.
to look at here just real quick, because we skipped it.
Oh,
Is
did we?
yeah, well, in verse 19, where where it says, now Saul and they, it's awkwardly worded, now Saul and they and all the men of Israel were in the valley of Elah fighting with the Philistines. So I'm curious about this. So is Goliath just sitting out while the rest of the Philistines fight? Is that what's going on? Does he come up every morning and offer this challenge and then just go take a rest?
We really don't have any indication other than that verse. There might have been some minor skirmishes, holding the line that
Uh-huh.
from each side, you weren't going to progress past this point.
Yeah.
But it does seem like Goliath really, he steps out, makes his threat, goes and sits down in the shade somewhere, and then comes back in the evening. But there's not the major clash. The huge battle isn't happening yet. Most of the time, well, as a matter of fact, when we get to another scripture, we find out that when Goliath comes out, everybody runs away.
Right.
So there is some interaction, but I think it's from what I'm reading, and I may be wrong, but from what I'm reading, I think it's more just holding the line.
Okay.
And, because if you're sitting there for 40 days looking at an opposing army, almost every commander is going to, send out a few people to go check for weaknesses in the line. And
Mhm.
there's going to be a little back and forth, some rocks flung just to remind people, hey, I'm still here.
Yeah.
I still defy you. I'm still going to continue to hold my place. So there's just not a lot of detail given. And that's one of the things the Bible really doesn't care about the mechanics of the battle a lot of times. And how many battles do we have? Oh, and they fought and this many died and moving on. It's,
Sure.
So it's one of those details that we kind of like, come on, guys, a little bit more information would be great. So, but yeah, we are describing that scene with what's happening in the valley. And yes, Saul was there, but evidently he's not going out to meet the giant, which is a huge contrast from
Mhm.
what's getting ready to come up. David even leaves the baggage with the keeper, so he's even being responsible with other people's things.
Mhm.
So when he gets there after he leaves the baggage, he runs to the front line, which nobody else is doing this. He's eager to be in the midst of that battle. And as he's greeting his brothers, he hears about the Philistines' taunts. Now, we can read a whole lot into that when we're looking at the life of Christ, that Jesus is the good shepherd. He's willing to obey his Father.
Mhm.
That during his time away from us, he has left us in the keeping of the Holy Spirit.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, like I said, there's a lot of things we can play with. And I'm not going to go into it right now because I think it's going to become even more obvious later. And I think, most Christians are already familiar with a lot of those concepts, even if they haven't seen them with David. So, verse 24, we're told for a second time that all of Israel is afraid. The writer wants you to understand they're terrified.
Mhm.
And they do run when Goliath comes out. And, think about, 40 days having to watch him lumber out there every morning. This big dude. You kind of wonder how graceful he was, how,
Mhm.
they've been seeing him in all of his shining armor, which it was polished to perfection.
Sure.
Bronze can be polished to the point it can be used as a mirror.
Right.
So, he looks radiant in the light of the morning, when the sun's coming up. And, he tosses the insults back out and then he goes back to camp. And for 40 days, this psychological warfare has been inflicted on the nation of Israel. And psychological warfare has real ramifications. We've seen that in modern times. And man, you don't want to have to be exposed to something that's constantly just eroding at your confidence, both within yourself and within the army you're with and the nation you serve. And, you know, now, whenever there is warfare and there's this kind of propaganda being tossed out, that's one of the first strikes and one of the first things armies will go against, to shut down those kinds of voices because they don't want the troops demoralized. So imagine being in this situation where the brothers are. And, you know, the other thing too, I want to make sure I get this. There we go. Make sure I get my notes in order. David's not the only one with the sling during all of this.
Sure.
I mean, this would have been a weapon almost anyone who had sheep. And who had sheep? Almost everyone.
Yeah.
They would have had it. And the front lines would have been made up of Saul's own tribe, the tribe of Benjamin. Well, in Judges 20:16, 600 men from the tribe of Benjamin were left-handed sling throwers who didn't miss. So Saul's own tribe, the most ideally prepared, Saul himself, the most ideally suited, they're all standing there for 40 days trembling in front of Goliath. And there's a good possibility that Saul even knew how to use a sling.
Right.
But he had forgotten who he was. And anytime you forget who you are, there's a problem. And this is the reason why we as Christians have to constantly be reminding ourselves who we are. And that we aren't, you know, what everybody is around us, that we are set apart, we're different, and why we have to surround ourselves with people who are also set apart. Because if you aren't constantly being reminded of who God says you are, your confidence begins to erode and you wind up running away every time a giant shows up in your world.
Sure.
So, you know, and that's another point. If you want to identify yourself with someone in this story, identify yourself with the troops of Israel who are, you know, shaking in their boots in the trenches. You're not David, guys. Most of us aren't. And that's not who David is supposed to represent.
Right.
So we need the champion to fight on our behalf. So anyway, I won't meddle too much. Verse 25. The men of Israel, this is not a quote, but the men of Israel asked David if he has seen the man who is shouting the challenge. And they tell David that he's come out to reproach, that Goliath has come out to reproach Israel. And then they list off all these things that Saul's going to give anyone who slays this giant. And it's riches. He's going to give them one of his daughters as a wife, and the father's house will be free.
I think that's really interesting. And the father's house, that phrasing there, the father's house would be free, which I assume means that all the household is no longer would be like tax exempt and didn't have to fight in the armies and things like that.
Wouldn't be taken by Saul to live in, you know, his royal courts. Remember what Goliath said. They're slaves and servants of Saul. And so, yes, but you were absolutely right about the taxation. That probably would have been included. And they're also very free of the military draft. All the things, you got it. And of course, you know, this does echo with Christ's own promise for us. You know, the Father's people will be free. The Savior will receive a bride, who's the church, and we're going to be rich. And when I say rich, I'm not talking monetarily. I'm talking about, you know, and all the things that really matter.
Sure.
And, you know, don't get confused. Money can be a blessing from God. It's not a guaranteed blessing from God, and we're not promoting that. So I want to make it very, very clear. So, verse 26, and David said to the man who stood by him, "What shall be done for the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel?" Well, he'd just been told. And he says, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So David has his moment where he's like, "Wait, hold on. Let's get this straight. Whoever kills the giant gets what? Tell me again. I want to make sure." And you can almost hear David's wheels turning in his head, just click, 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 click. He knows who he is. And he sees an opportunity where, hey, maybe I can get a little closer to where God has promised he's going to send me.
Well, and I do think probably in David's head, there's probably a bit of this going, this is how God's going to deliver me from being subject to Saul.
Yeah.
At that point, I think he's taking. It would seem to me like he's taking the word free to be like, so how free are we talking here,
How
right?
free is free?
Is it totally like he's no longer my king free? Is that where we're at?
Well, and David is an interesting guy because every situation he approaches, the things that are said about you often about David, that was not Freudian at all. But anyway, the things that are said about David are really interesting because you really aren't certain how you should read them a lot of time. Is this manipulation? Is this, plotting and scheming?
Surely not one of the holy, sacred people of faith that God used in the Old Testament.
Well,
I mean, they would never do anything like that, right?
see Ruth.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so, well, and David's, direct ancestor. But the thing is, there's also that room for, is this an act of pure faith?
Uh-huh.
You don't know, but contrast that with Saul, and especially as we get further into Saul's story, we're always told exactly what Saul is thinking.
Mhm.
We don't have to guess. He's going to lay it out on the line. Where with David, like I said, the writer, it's like the writer himself doesn't know what to make of David.
Right.
And so you have this kind of veil of mystery about why he's why he does what he does and what his thought process is and what he's feeling. And really the only time you get a clear window into David's soul really are the Psalms. So we're going to talk about how those play in later. But this is a tailor-made opportunity for a newly appointed king, a newly secretly appointed king.
Mhm.
There's money, there's a legitimate connection to the royal family.
Mhm.
It would not have been uncommon for a son-in-law to succeed the father-in-law within this time period, especially if the sons weren't considered worthy.
Sure.
So he would have the right family at this point. He wouldn't be just from the family of Jesse, who's nobody. And we're going to talk about the significance of that. His own families, of course, they're going to benefit from it. And that includes all of his brothers, his fathers. And this is huge because not only is it relieve a financial obligation off of the family, this also means this opens up marriage possibilities into better echelons within the society
Mhm,
itself,
mhm.
which means more land, which means even more riches that can be accumulated. I mean, it's a great opportunity. And, just the fact that the prestige that would come with, having killed the giant.
Mhm.
And, the thing is, I think David might be young right here, but he's not naive.
Right.
I have a hard time seeing David as ever being naive. And so that might just be me. But I think he's the kind of person who saw through everything, and he saw multiple layers in every situation he approached.
Right. Now, I do have questions about the order of the story here.
Okay.
Is it possible that this event happened before David was anointed and before he was taken to the palace to play the harp or the lyre? I'm sorry. But because
that right.
I wonder about this because when the people talk about David, they say he's a man of war. And before that, if that all happened before this, how do we know he's a man of war?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I'm really curious if there's maybe this part of the story is it's like the prequel to the stuff we have already read.
That's actually a very real possibility. And there are scholars who have said that the two chapters, 17 and 16, were reversed.
Okay.
And so and there is a certain level of sense to that argument. I think I actually go into, I wrote my notes like 2 days ago, but I still have a hard time remembering what they were because there was just so much. And I think I actually look at some of the reasons why that may work and why it may not work. And because there are good arguments for and against both readings. And I think the main thing is, it isn't so much the chronology, but the fact that they did happen. And so we can't let that shake us too much. But there is a certain amount of sense in knowing that David had established a reputation. And of course, this would do it. Would be exactly why, Saul's advisors would know him. And because at the end of the chapter, when Saul is being told about David's victory over Goliath, Abner, Saul's general, has no idea who David is. Well, if David's been at the courts playing the lyre for Saul all this time, you can't tell me that Abner hadn't, run into them. But we're going to talk about that's where we're going to talk about the chronology when we get to that part.
Okay.
So,
but I was curious about that. I mean, of course, I could see I could see people not knowing the name of the musician. I mean, especially if he's like, I don't know what style, if he's a jazz musician, just playing stuff in the, no one knows the name of the guy who's playing at the cocktail party.
Not unless they're Miles Davis, but
well,
that's a whole other story.
He's not playing cocktail parties. Well,
not anymore.
Not anymore. Well, yeah, I mean,
if he is, you're the wrong
by the time
place.
everyone knew by the time everyone knew his name, I'm sure he was not playing just random cocktail parties anymore. So, sorry.
Rabbit trails.
But no, I was just curious about that.
No, but it's a good question because I don't think people realize there are these little tip-offs in the scripture that we can pick up on if we're reading closely.
Right. And the other thing that, because it says he became his armor bearer in the palace. Now, the thing is, here in the ESV, it says I can't use these because I haven't tested them. Right. Well, if he's the armor bearer, he's going to be familiar with Saul's armor.
Right. That's a good point. I hadn't thought about that.
So that's, to me, that to me was one of the major tip-offs that maybe they were backward.
Yeah. And like I said, possibility. I'm still kind of on the fence, but here's the thing. Saul's losing his mind at this point.
Sure.
Saul is completely unstable because he's constantly being tormented by that evil spirit. So whoever is encountering Saul, even on a day-to-day basis, might not be someone that Saul's keeping track of too closely. And so for me, that's the reason why Abner's statement made it more, more concrete and a possibility.
Sure.
Because what we find out about Abner, he seems to be a little bit more reliable.
Mentally?
Yeah, and just credible in his recollection of events and that sort of thing.
Fair enough. Well, let's move on. Sorry,
okay.
I didn't mean to get us way off track.
That's what we do here. This is the problem with our conversations, why they last 7 hours. But
yeah.
So, but I think what's interesting in David's statement here is he actually flips Goliath's challenge. He reverses it. And, who are you to draw up against me, Philistine, is what Goliath says. And David's, who is this uncircumcised Philistine? You dirty, low-down dog.
Yeah.
Who do you think you are?
Yeah. I don't know your name.
Yeah. And who is a Philistine to defy Israel? He thinks that he can defy Israel, and David's like, no, this is not what's going to go on. This is the total reverse, exact opposite of what should happen. Don't you guys see it? And David's the only one with the right perspective, and he reminds that they're not Saul's army. He reminds them that they don't belong to Saul. They're the army of the living God. The living God always denotes God's active participation within the world of the living.
Yeah. Well, didn't you say there's also, it could be translated the God of the living as opposed to the living God? Mm-hmm. Because that's the thing that title, the living God, I know that's been used by a lot of people to try to discredit the divine council worldview. Right. The idea that, the Bible calls him the living God. And then, of course, you're like, you're putting a whole lot of emphasis on
word structure,
a lot of word structure. But yeah, just going through that and saying, the living God versus all the other gods who are fake, that's not what's being necessarily conveyed here. Yeah. Is what you're saying.
Yeah. God, this is a God who's active and participating in the lives of the people of Israel. Mm-hmm. And that's what David wants the army to remember, because if we don't have that little piece in play, then why should they be afraid? Why should they stand up against Goliath? There's no reason. I mean, pack up your bags and go home. You're living in a tent anyway. Just move a little further out in the desert. No one's going to care. Mm-hmm. I mean, this is not what do they really have to fight for? The only thing they have to fight for is the fact that God said this land is theirs. And the fact that they're still occupying the land demonstrates a level of faith and a level of trust within God, even though they seem to have forgotten who God is and why God wants them to occupy this place. But there's something really subtle going on with David's words here, and I would have not picked this up if it was not for Samura. He notes that when David says, "For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God," according to the ESV. If you go over to Psalms 8:4,
Okay.
"For who is this man that thou art mindful of him?"
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so this is based on a very specific word order and structure of a Hebrew word. The word "for," it's not used this way very often. And of course, Psalms 8 it's a messianic psalm and is used to talk about the Messiah. It is quoted or alluded to in the New Testament in 1 Corinthians 15:25-27, Philippians 3:21, Ephesians 1:22, Matthew 21:14-16, and Hebrews 2:5-9 and Hebrews 2:5-9 quote it verbatim. So,
which is interesting that it's got that many citations because it's a very short psalm. It's 9 verses long.
Precisely. And, the New Testament writers make it strikingly clear that Jesus is the fulfillment of this particular psalm. And so I'm just going to read Hebrews 2:5-9 because I think it makes the point without me having to say a whole lot more. It says, "For it was not to the angels that God subjected the world to come, of which we are speaking. It has been testified somewhere. What is man that you are mindful of him, or the son of man that you should care for him? You have made him flesh. You have made him a little lower than the angels. You have crowned him with the glory and honor, putting everything in subjection under his feet. Now in putting everything in subjection to him, he left nothing outside his control. At present, we do not yet see everything in subjection to him, but we see him who for a little while was made lower than the angels, namely Jesus, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering and death, so that by the grace of God he might taste death for everyone." So this psalm specifically is about Christ.
Mm-hmm.
We can't get around that, and that's the main point. And it demonstrates, because David wrote it, David sees the world from God's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
He understands how things work. And this is a prophetic understanding. And I think sometimes we forget that David is a prophet. Even though he's king, he's also a prophet. You don't write the Psalms that he wrote if you don't have that prophetic understanding of the world. Now, again, when I say prophet, I'm not talking about someone who foretells the future. I'm talking about someone who can see and see reality as it is and articulate it to the listening audience. The Psalms do this.
Mm-hmm.
The Psalms do this. And I should also, that reminds me, I was invited to do a guest post for C Ministries, and talking about the role of the prophet in the church today. Doug Overmeyer, who is the head of that, founder of that, invited me to do that. So we talk about that. If you want to know more, be sure and go over to Doug's site. He's got some really great stuff on there to talk about your prophecy and seeing and all of these different things in the modern world. So a shout out to Doug because he's been great.
Yeah, he's been a big supporter. And
we're going to get him on the show at some point. And he also has a podcast. So
yeah, consider yourself warned, Doug.
Yeah. Oh, no, he knows. He's ready. But yeah, David, he really, he understands humanity's position.
We actually had him on the commentarians.
We did.
By the way.
We did. I know, because I was the one who hosted that.
Yeah, it's a good episode. I was letting everyone else know while we're talking about.
Yeah, and Luke had him on his show.
Oh, yeah.
So, yeah. So. It changed my mind. So we've got, Doug's been around.
Right.
We want to have him back. But I want to read this quote by Rolf A. Jacobson. I think this really sums it up nicely about David's ability to see humanity's position within these conflicts. And he sees conflicts, again, they're not just wars between two human armies or two human men. They are conflicts between God and these other spiritual entities, the godlets, the little e Elohim. So Jacobson says, I just have to make that clear because this is not pantheism, it's not polytheism, it's not henotheism. Our God is distinct, he is different. And that's the reason why it's still monotheism.
Sure.
So, okay, so Jacobson, he says, this is the central paradox and the heart of the human identity. We are a creation of small account, bearing the dust of the earth in our bodies and the nature of animals in our ways and being. Yet we are of heaven, carrying our Maker's mark on our souls and sharing in the likeness and image of God. Caught up in the glories of this paradox, the psalmist can find no other words equal to the situation than these. O Lord, our Lord, how magnificent is your name in all the earth. So when David is saying this to Goliath, he's reminding Israel, this is who you are. You were created in the image of the one true God. You need to stand up and act like men.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why he's so adamant that we not just stop and cower in the ditches. And
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I hear one of the girls has a harmonica.
Oh, is that what it is?
I was trying to
I
figure
thought it was
out
a car horn, but
sorry if that's coming through the mics.
Now, and I should also, since we mentioning friends of the podcast, Carmen Imes, bearing God's name and talking about the image of God and our humanity's position. Y'all guys need to check her stuff out too. She's doing some great stuff with her work, and just solid. Wow, and because I think this is fundamentally. This is an issue I think every human being has to struggle with. I mean, we're either arrogant jerks or we're Eeyores.
Mm-hmm.
And, not much of a house for not much of a donkey. And we're feeling sorry for ourselves. And we have to find that middle ground where we can say that, we're worthy of love and we're worthy of, being treated well and respect and the things that come along, basic things that should come along with being human. Because we are created in God's image, and disrespecting God's image in anyone should be unthinkable.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, we need to recognize we're not God. And I think that's where most of us mess up, and we think that we have some kind of right to being treated above and beyond what any human being has a right to.
Mm-hmm.
So finding that balance has always been the problem. And I think we see that balance in David's Psalms. That not only in Psalms 8, but in so many of them where he goes through wrestling with, hey, this is how horrible of a person I am.
Mm-hmm.
This is how awful my situation is. But I do serve the living God. I serve the holy God of Israel. And this is why it's all good. And this is why I can be at peace and I can worship. And so for David to pose this question to Goliath, who is this? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? It really alerts us to the fact that David, he's something special, because most young people we're talking probably 18, 19, he's below the age where he has to serve in the army.
Mm-hmm.
They don't have that kind of perspective.
Right.
There's a few. I mean, I'm not saying that you can't be this young and have that perspective. But those are standouts.
Right. Well, and I now what I think is interesting, along with his speech, is that the people answered him. The people answered in the same way. So basically, Saul's been there the whole time, and the whole project stalled out. Right. The whole battle is just at a standstill, and David comes in. And without even with just doing what he does naturally. So we have this natural leadership quality that he knows how to talk to the people.
He's working the crowds.
To get them, to encourage them. So I think that's what's really interesting. And I think too often in the church, we overlook the people who have those natural leadership abilities.
Yes.
And I might be speaking out of my own experience, but I've seen it many times where
I've talked to so many people, it's the same thing.
Where the guys who actually have leadership experience and gifting, just that natural ability, get passed over. And unfortunately, I've talked to enough people, and I'm trying to be very delicate here, because of, I don't want anyone's.
You want to tell your story, not everyone else's.
I don't want to tell everyone else's story, but I've spoken to enough pastors and people behind the scenes to know that a lot of the reason that these people get passed over is because the lead pastor is threatened by them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's unfortunate.
It is.
I mean, basically you have these pastors, they're playing the role of Saul.
No, actually I would say Saul's smarter. Because Saul's out there taking them. He brings David into his house.
Well, that's true. But it's
let
just,
that one sink in, guys.
Yeah. So anyway, but that's
But no, you're absolutely right.
Frustrating to see this, that
a good
that it
pastor.
goes on. I didn't mean to go there. It's just one of the things that I just happened to notice in the text. There's that natural leadership ability in David.
It is valid, and I the thing is, I think a good pastor should be constantly trying to work himself out of a job.
Absolutely.
And we should always be trying to bring people in who are willing and able to pursue a leadership position, not out of any kind of sense of hubris or entitlement, but someone who really wants to serve the Lord. And sometimes having that leadership position is the best use of their gifts in service to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And we were talking about this. I know I'm going off on a rabbit trail, and we're like at time, but
no, whatever.
We were talking about this last night, and this is one of the things that you and I deal with is don't look at us, but check out our podcast,
right?
And trying to figure out, where we fit into that, because I don't want to brag on this because that's kind of counter to what I'm going to say, but I do think that one of the things that we try to do is to have a very real perspective of the fact that this is about us, but it's totally not about us.
Right. Yeah.
It's scary.
It is. Yeah. And it's like and I really appreciate like all of our supporters, but to me, every time we get a new Patreon supporter, I'm like, oh my gosh, we have responsibilities to people. And so I definitely appreciate all the support.
Yeah.
And
I'm always shocked.
I am every time. I'm like, oh my gosh, are we actually doing something? So I'm glad people are letting us know they appreciate what we're doing.
Absolutely.
But again, we do try to keep that perspective that it's not about us and our agendas and what we want to push. It's about learning to love God and to love studying the text and to help other people learn those things. That's all we want to do.
Well, I think that's what happens with most people who really love the Bible. It's like you build up this level of learning so much, and then finally you get to a certain level and it's up in your throat, and every time you open your mouth, you're just telling people, hey, I learned this and I'm so excited. And then they get like 50 years of backlog of all the stuff that you've been setting on, and they're just trying to get away, and you won't. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, it's an ugly situation at a party. I've been there. I've been the person.
Oh yeah.
So
I've been that person at a party too, where you're like,
it's like they don't care about the Hebrew and Greek syntax. It doesn't even cross their mind. But so this allows us to kind of have a relief valve, so we don't injure those around us.
Yeah, very helpful. So everyone, thank you so much for that.
Yeah. So but what you said about David was 100% correct. He and I want to just wrap this whole part up. He is working the crowd. He is saying the same thing over and over and over again. He's getting the same response. He's both checking it out. He's building people up. He's doing the right things, so much so that he's going to hack off his older brother. And we're going to get into that next week.
All right. So, well, let's take a break and we'll get there. For us in 10 minutes or so. For you guys next week, and we hope you come back and join us. And we're having fun here doing this. And if you want to be part of the conversation and see what's going on, maybe get some previews of what we're looking at, be sure to hit us up on Raven Creek SC on all the social media and ravencreeksc.com, where you can be in contact, ask questions, be part of the conversation. And we will see you next week. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to the Faith and Other Oddities podcast, a Raven Creek Social Club production. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. If you like what you've heard, please write us a review on iTunes or consider supporting us on patreon.com/RavenCreekSC. As always, thank you for listening and don't forget to join us next week.